Hello, my name is Benjamin, my pronouns are he, his, and I'm the creator of the Color by Buttons World game in Dreams. I wanted to create a video summarizing how I developed the game for anyone else interested in seeing a concrete example of someone else's creative process. This video will be in two parts. In the first part, I'll describe how I came up with the overall theme and mechanic of the level. In the second part, I'll describe how I came up with the puzzles in the level. As you'll see in this video, the initial idea I started with was very different from the final idea. Hopefully you'll enjoy seeing how my thought process changed along the way. The games that interest me the most are typically those with game mechanics I haven't seen before. As such, when I create games, I try to come up with original mechanics too. At least in my case though, this is easier said than done, and I don't know of an easy way to go about it. My thought process in coming up with a mechanic is different every time, but there is a general direction my thinking takes. In particular, I often begin by thinking about the core components of a particular game genre with the goal of figuring out a way to alter one of these core components. For example, the idea in one of my previous levels, Camera World, was created from this process. In most platformers, the player has no control over how time goes forward in the level. I wanted to play with this established norm, so I created a level in which the player can freeze time whenever they wanted. I should note that this idea wasn't truly unique, of course. For example, Jonathan Blow explored time mechanics thoroughly and in far greater detail in the 2000s with his exceptional game Braid. And there were games before Braid which also messed around with time. This said, I think time manipulation is still an idea that most platformers don't explore, and as such, I think there is still room for new puzzle ideas based around time mechanics. But back to the main subject of this video. In the case of Color by Buttons World, I began by thinking about how characters in most games move between at most 3 dimensions. I started thinking about how much I loved the dimension switching mechanics in the levels A Crack in the Slab from Dishonored 2, Effect and Cause from Titanfall 2, and Parallel Universes from Sayonara Wild Hearts. These are all 4D levels instead of standard 3D levels. Thinking about these examples made me think about how I could make a 4D level in Dreams. However, I quickly ran into many design problems. The biggest issue in my opinion was how to avoid the situation where a player switches dimensions and ends up in the middle of another object. If this happens, the player should presumably die, which can cause frustration if the player didn't know this was going to happen. I should note that this exact situation was explored as a mechanic in Chroma Jump by Dopefish in 2020, which is on Dreams. In Chroma Jump you can switch dimensions at any time, but if you happen to switch into a dimension in which you collide with an object, you die. I think the concept works in Chroma Jump, but I didn't want the player to die this way in my game. This meant I would have to stop the player from switching dimensions if it would result in death. If the player didn't know why they were unable to switch, however, they could easily get frustrated. If I were able to come up with a way to visually show the objects in other dimensions, the player would be able to visually see when they could switch or not. But how exactly could I do this? I realized that I could potentially show the outlines of all objects at once. Outlines would convey the general shape of an object and also make it clear whether such an object was occupying the current dimension or not. I should note that this solution of showing objects with outlines is not unique in Dreams. I had previously played the platformer Island Quest by Snako1517, and their mechanic was almost exactly what I had in mind. In Island Quest there are only 2 dimensions, these are represented by 2 colors. Objects that do not exist in both dimensions at once have a dashed outline, and the dimensions are distinguished by the color of the outline. Unlike Island Quest, I wanted to be able to combine at least 4 dimensions. With a number as large as this, it would be difficult to differentiate the objects using line color. I needed a more robust way to visually convey which world an object came from than just varying the line color. I thought that a crude but effective way to distinguish the dimensions was to put labels on the object specifying the dimension. This idea of putting labels such as A or B on the object seemed very silly though, and somewhat distracting. While I was thinking about potential solutions around this, I realized that the gameplay would be more interesting if instead of the player switching between dimensions, the player could add dimensions together. That is, the player could decide which objects they could see at any given time. At this stage I began to get excited. I had a feeling that a game based around warping objects in and out could be very fun, and allow me to explore and develop puzzles no one had experienced before. But there was still the unsolved problem of how to deal with the labeling of objects. Additionally, and maybe more importantly, what would be a good theme which fit this mechanic of swapping objects in and out of the world? I think themes fitting mechanics is an important but overlooked part of game design, and something I wish was more commonplace. I should note that the entire reason why my previous Camera World level was themed around cameras was because, in my mind, photographs are frozen moments in time. I chose the camera theme after coming up with the mechanic of stopping time, not the other way around. I also think that mechanics fitting controller input is another important but too often overlooked part of game design. The reason why in Camera World the button R1 is used to freeze time is because it is approximately in the same location as the photo button on a digital camera. That is, it is located on the top right of the device and activated with the index finger. Hence pressing the button on the DualShock is similar to the real-world action of taking a photo. It seemed difficult to apply a similar controller input idea in this new game though, so I focused my thinking on possible themes. How could I come up with a theme for the new level which fit the mechanic? I don't know exactly how it came to me, but when a color by numbers painting entered my head, I knew at once it would be an excellent fit. After all, the regions in a color by numbers painting have labels, like the objects in my game. Furthermore, the labels tell you which color to use. As such, in my game I could just indicate the label of the button which would color the object when pressed, and it would be both intuitive and predictable. And so at this point I had done what I think is the hardest part of game design, coming up with an original mechanic that is complicated enough to allow interesting new puzzles, and a level theme in which the mechanic naturally fits. Now my favorite part of the game creation process could finally begin, coming up with the puzzles themselves. Well, almost. I still needed to check that my idea could actually be implemented in Dreams. This is a technical question that depends entirely on the physics abilities of the Dreams engine and the creative tools available. The hardest problem to solve was figuring out how to allow the player to pass through a large object and simultaneously detect them, and to do so without using a green detection zone for the large object. Why this is important is perhaps not clear, so I'll briefly explain why. The standard green detection zones are okay for simple situations, but are a nightmare for complicated detection zones. If, whenever I made an object in the game, I would also have to create a custom detection zone, I would at best be doubling the sculpting work. Worse, I'd run into the nightmare of having to adjust both the sculpt and its detection zone whenever I wanted to adjust an object in the game. Of course, in the process of developing a platformer, objects get adjusted all the time. Further, some shapes simply cannot be feasibly made using green detection zones. It turns out that creating complex detection zones without green detection zones is possible. It can be done using collision properties and tags. TapJills has made a video explaining the idea. The link is in the video information below if you're interested. Color by Buttons World is also remixable, so if you're curious as to how everything works in my game, you can just make a copy of the scene and open it up in the level editor. Once I implemented the solution, I had a working prototype and was extremely happy. Finally, I could do what for me is one of the most fun things in the world. Playing around with a mechanic I haven't thought about before, and then sharing my discoveries with the world in the form of some new and challenging puzzles. I don't want this video to be overly long, so I'll pause here. In part 2, which you can find linked below, I'll talk about how I came up with the set pieces in the game. That is, the office, the map of New York City, the Tetris game, and the abstract artworks. Thanks for watching.